O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy...
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Duzen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
On this podcast episode, we are discussing the book The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. It has been noted as one of the most important books in the 20th century, in recent times. I guess in the past 100 years or so. I actually got this from this opinion from a podcast, the Theology Pugcast, that discusses cultural issues and how Christianity should respond to our culture. So it's highly regarded by academics. It is an academic work. I'd say it's pretty important. It has very good ideas, two of which are first being the natural law concept, that there is a natural objective moral standard that everyone recognizes. And secondly, that our culture in Western society is being manipulated and warped by cultural elites who are attempting to mold people into thinking the way they want them to think, basically, making them kind of slaves to the system of society. And I think you see that today, that many people are deceived. And there is a small number of people who are at the top influencing society's values and norms, and that's what C.S. Lewis makes an argument for, that the elites of society are claiming to try to liberate man from nature, he says, but that actually abolishes man, and that's why he calls it the abolition of man. But the more important point he makes is that there is an objective moral standard that everyone recognizes. And that standard is talked about in Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 2, verses 12 to 16, that I want to read to you to start off the podcast. And then we'll get into who C.S. Lewis was, what's the background for this book, and then we'll get into the book itself, describing what are the main points of it, and what are its faults, what are its good qualities, and then what we should take away at the end. So Romans 2, verses 12 to 16, Paul writes this: "For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are just before God, but the doers of the law will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these, not having the law, are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them, on the day when, according to my gospel, God will judge the secrets of men through Christ Jesus." So one of C.S. Lewis's main points in this book is that Gentiles, well, all people, have a law within them, the work of the law that Paul says here is written in their hearts, and that is given to them through their conscience bearing witness and their thoughts accusing them. So C.S. Lewis is going to argue in this book that everyone knows there is an objective moral standard, this law, that God demands us to live by, although he's not going to say that people know that it's God that demands it. But he's going to say that people have lived by this law, this what he's going to call a Tao, that we'll get into what that term means. People have lived by this since the beginning of time, and most people still do in his day, in C.S. Lewis's day, but they were beginning to take drastic steps and increasing steps to divorce people from this standard and to impose new standards on people. So, C.S. Lewis, Casey, who is he? What's the background for the book? Why did he write it?
All right. So C.S. Lewis was born in Ireland. I didn't realize he was Irish until I studied him a little bit more. In 1898, grew up. He had one brother, and was apparently a fairly lonely childhood, where he was tutored up until about age 10. Him and his brother would play, and actually the seeds of the Narnia world were developed by him and his brother with talking animals and stuff in this world that they made up. But so as he's a child, then I think his mother died when he was 9, maybe. I mean, obviously this affected him quite a bit, and his father basically kept sending him to different schools to learn, and obviously he was very bright.
What kind of there were boarding schools and
like he got sent to England for a while. Then he at some point he came back home and had another tutor that was very high, highly regarded tutor. He was also very unhealthy as far as had respiratory problems, was always seen as kind of sickly. A lot of times he wouldn't be, it'd be like, you need to stay in, like you can't go out and play type of thing. That was partially why I was lonely all the time. But so just very introspective, thinks a lot, and has a very good education. He goes to Oxford, I think at 18, but very shortly after enlists and goes into World War I.
Enlist in what?
Enlist in the army.
Right.
And in World War I, he was on the front for a couple months, and basically like the friend that was like his really good friend that they had said, all right, if you die, I'll take care of your family, and if I die, you take care of my family. They were, I don't know but basically they're out there, and then the friend got like blown up right in front of him.
Oh man.
And then he also got severely wounded during this, and basically got taken back and took several months to recover. By the time he had recovered, they basically were like, well, you're still in the army, but the war is almost over, so he didn't really have to do anything at that point. But so he did see action in World War I, saw bad action. Which I would say too, just to look forward a bit, is encouraging to me in reading some of his other works, reading the Chronicles of Narnia, and obviously he had to process this, and he said that this led to his clamping down on atheism for a while. But it's encouraging to me that somebody that went through the trenches of World War I, saw like his best friend get blown up, got all injured himself, was able to, through the grace of God and God's work, to process that and get through that and get to a point where you can read the Chronicles of Narnia and see the joy in this man. And so I just thought that was encouraging, reading about somebody going through something like that. Yeah, go ahead.
And as a matter of fact, isn't his one of his biographical works Surprised by Joy? Is that what it's called? It
is, but that's because Joy is his wife.
Oh, okay.
Which is a different thing.
I thought he was talking about the joy of salvation.
No, that's about his wife.
Oh, okay.
But so he goes back after the war. He's at Oxford, and very, very intelligent. He gets graduates, I think, at age 22 with 3 different degrees. One was definitely philosophy. I want to say another was English, and there was a third one. I'm not sure what it was. And at 22, he gets immediately asked to teach philosophy, right there at Oxford, which is rare.
Yeah. I would think, wasn't the other degree in like medieval studies or something like that?
It may have been. I mean, it was something that correlated with the other ones. And so right from graduating, he takes up a teaching job where he teaches, I believe, philosophy is what they had him do. And so the next few years, he is a staunch atheist, like one that's trying to convert other people to atheism. And he writes about that time that ironically he was angry at God for not existing, and also angry at God for creating the world. And you can see at this time that, having just gone through World War I, lost his mother, was a very lonely childhood. He's a bitter man at this time, but very, very smart, to the point where when he meets J.R.R. Tolkien is one of the first people he's met that is like, oh, this guy's smart too. And Tolkien is a Catholic, but a very devout Catholic. And has the opinion, when they get talking about it, he's like, no, like smart people should believe in God. And C.S. Lewis is like, no, smart people don't believe in God. And they kind of have it out, but they quickly become friends because there's not that many people on that level of intelligence and with the same interest in language and in literature.
And in medieval history.
Yes, and in medieval history. And Tolkien basically, God uses him to the point where C.S. Lewis says he was one of the most reluctant converts in history. That just through the logic and arguing with him, he comes to believe that yes, there is a God, and he becomes a theist first for a couple of years, and then a couple of years after that he converts to Christianity. He joins the Anglican Church and is an Anglican layman, right through to the end of his life. And so then through the rest of his life, he becomes an as much as he was trying to convert people to atheism, he was trying to convert people to Christianity, and largely through his writings. And I think he wrote like 30 some books, some fictional, like Chronicles of Narnia, obviously, and some just like this was more of a lecture, but some more just like philosophical or just about how Christianity works, and he's become maybe right up there near the top for best known Christian writers in the 21st century or 20th century. Yeah. And so this book particularly was a series of lectures given during the World War II period to other professors in Oxford. And it's very, a lot of his books, I'd say one of his gifts as a writer is to take complicated ideas and to make them simplified so that people like me can understand them. This book is not that. Right. This is two Oxford professors. It's very high level. And we'll talk about what the meaning of it, what he's getting at into it. So just to kind of conclude his life story, it's shortly after this, after World War II, and Mere Christianity was written during World War II as well as a broadcast to the general public, and where he's explaining why they should be Christians, and at least his explanation of it. So then after World War II is when he writes Chronicles of Narnia, and then he dies in 1963, which actually slightly interesting note here. So apparently his last several months he knew he was sick and he didn't want a big to do about his death because he's quite famous at that time. And so he's praying that it would be overshadowed. And on the same day that he died, well, oddly enough, Aldous Huxley died, but also
I don't know who that is.
Brave New World. You ever read that one?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then also JFK was shot. Yeah. And so that was the end of C.S. Lewis as far as his life, but his writing certainly lives on. So I don't know if you had anything to add, or if we want to get into this book particular.
Let's get into the Abolition of Man. Like I said, I was recommended it by a podcast, and so it has two main. I'd say it has two main points. You can add any other points, Casey, if you disagree or have any nuances. It's divided into 3 chapters. But I'd say the most important points of the book are, first of all, the subjective moral standard that exists, that almost all people hold to, and they know it by nature.
And I would say also, I think Mere Christianity is more popular than this, and Mere Christianity spends a good portion making the same argument about an objective moral law that has always been in existence.
Yeah. And Lewis argues that everyone recognizes this. Almost everyone recognizes this law that he calls the Tao. And we can discuss why he calls it the Tao a little later. But the second point is that which he gets into towards the middle and the end of the book, is that there's an elite class of people throughout society, and it's I don't know when he thinks they started doing this, but at the very least during the Enlightenment era with people like John Locke, He believes there is an elite class of people that are trying to change people, this traditional moral standard of values, to suit their own ends, to change people into whatever they want them to be. And what's interesting, the way he describes it is that they are. He basically describes them as secular humanists that are trying to boil everything down to, I guess, just what works. Like there's no like good, true, beautiful things, but everything is just mechanistic. It's excessively scientific and analytical. So basically, he describes this as what is natural and what is not natural. What is of nature and what is of not nature. He says that the elites are trying to conquer nature, and the ultimate end of conquering nature is to conquer the nature of man. And there's at this point
I do think too, when he's talking about the nature of man, he's definitely at least partially referring to the Tao, this natural understanding that there is good, there is beauty,
right,
there is right
inherently in man.
And so he's saying that these people want to conquer that in people, so that people will not feel that they're subject to this natural law, but can do whatever they want.
Right. Yeah. It's basically autonomy.
Yeah.
Being self-autonomous. So the famous, like the most explicit sentence he writes on page 64 is that man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man. So the conquest of nature. They're trying to conquer nature, and he says they're trying to do it through scientific endeavors. And he gives 3 examples of such so-called conquest of nature: the airplane, the wireless, which would be the radio, I believe, and the contraceptives. It says they're trying to conquer the things that hold man down from doing whatever he wants, basically. And at the end, they're going to try to conquer man, and by conquering man, they're going to simply remove man's inherent value from him. They're going to make man no longer man, but simply a thing.
Or I think basically one of his words were trousered apes.
Yeah.
That basically, if you take the man part out of people, then they're like beasts. And you even see that today, where a lot of people would refer to people as animals.
Right.
Like people, that's how science likes to view it, is that we are animals, just like everybody else. We're just, we have more of a highly evolved mind, but we're animals. And he would point that out and be like, with words like that, you're trying to make us animals.
Right. Well, obviously that does make us. Conceptually makes us animals.
Well, if you agree with it.
Right. That's a huge claim. All right, so to give an overview of the book.
If I may, I want to say, right at the beginning of each chapter, he has a little quote, and right at the beginning of his first chapter, he quotes. Mine just says traditional carol. I didn't look back to see where, but it's a Christmas carol. It says, "So he sent the word to slay and slew the little children." This is in reference.
Childer. You mean?
Childer. Sorry, I just filled in what my mind wanted it to be. This is in reference to Herod killing the infants in the carol.
Okay.
And so he puts this there as his introduction, basically saying that these people, these cultural elites that are trying to change the education system or the philosophical view of people, are slaying our children. And so that's his introduction into this. So I just wanted to point that out there.
Yeah, so he has a huge emphasis on children, especially in the first chapter. So the 3 chapters are entitled "Men Without Chests," The Way and the Abolition of Man. So the first chapter, Men Without Chests. Let's see here. So Men Without Chests is about, he starts this whole series of lectures by pointing out a textbook that he was given, that he read, and pointing out how it demonstrates how the popular education system was trying to get children to no longer recognize the traditional values, but to merely try to understand like things such as English. It was an English textbook in ways that have no grounding in what's good. So basically, education is pragmatic. He's saying it's simply to teach kids to have these skills to accomplish things to the end that the elites think are good.
Yeah, and up until, I mean, you can still see the remnants of it when C.S. Lewis is there. But even before that, I think it starts to switch over. Education was not an economic endeavor. The goal of education was not to end with the educated person having a job in whatever it was. It was to teach people more how to live,
right?
And more what was good and the right way to live,
right?
And I believe the one phrase that he may have used it, Augustine of Hippo, would talk about education as basically rightly ordering your loves.
Ordo Amoris, which we recently had our vice president talk about.
And so up until maybe 100 years ago, maybe a little bit more, education was about teaching people what the rightly ordered loves was, what you should love most, which things you should love, which things you should not love. And then it switched over to more, I would say, economic, to be like, you are going to school so that you can perform a task and get paid for it.
Yep.
And so he does bring that up. Let's see.
And the reason he calls it Men Without Chests is because he's describing these social elites, these educational elites that are, for example, the people that wrote the textbook that he talks about in the beginning. They are men without chests, because by chest he's referring to the heart. They're not trying to instill in young people values to love what's good and to
and he also views the chest as so your head is where you intellectually think through things, and your gut is where you feel things. And so the chest is the combination of those two, and where the head is able to control your emotions, because his view on it was in teaching people rightly ordered loves. It's basically like, you're going to have these emotions, but you need to understand which ones are good and how to control them.
Right.
And so the chest is where the two combine, where you have these emotions, but you know how to control them and what's good about them and what's bad about them and what to do with them. And he's saying they're ripping the chest right out. They just have these emotions, and they use their head to try to convince you that the emotions are fine. And on the emotions too, he does say that the way that they're teaching is much, and this is why he gets so much into objective truth, is that it's become less about what the objective truth is and more about how do you feel about it. Really, all you can know is that I feel this about such and such. And you can see that in our culture for sure. And you can also see how it would affect education, as far as if you're not teaching anything absolutely, to say this is this and we need to learn to be like this, then it's more of just a free-for-all. And I do have an interesting quote here. So this is C.S. Lewis's view of what the educator should do. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. So the educators that he was calling out we're basically saying we need to take out sentimentality. That if somebody says like, oh, he uses an example of a waterfall. If the waterfall is sublime, they're like, well, no, it's not that the waterfall is sublime, it's that you feel that way about it. And C.S. Lewis is saying, no, waterfalls are sublime. And really, the educator should help the student to recognize that waterfalls are sublime. And so basically saying, we're irrigating deserts. If somebody doesn't have that emotion in them, you irrigate them to understand what is good, what is sublime, and instead of just saying nope, no sentimentality, or if it is, it's just how you feel about it, and that doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and in this chapter, I think we'll hit on this point and then go to our break. But he introduces the Tao in this chapter, and he goes through a bunch of different spiritual religious traditions that describe this. After he says what was the traditional objective of education, when he references Augustine and Aristotle, so he goes through a Hindu concept of this cosmic order, Plato talking about an objective good. And then he goes to the Chinese and the Jews having the law being true, but he chooses to use the Chinese concept of the Tao, which he defines on page 18 as the reality beyond all predicates, the abyss that was before the Creator himself. It is nature, it is the way, the road. It is the way in which the universe goes on, the way in which things everlastingly emerge, stilly and tranquilly, into space and time. So then he goes on the same page. This is basically how he defines what this concept that he's saying is very similar among several different traditions and religions, and he defines it on page 18 as what is common to what is the same about all these concepts. He says what is common to them all is something we cannot neglect. It is the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are. And that's what he calls the Tao, which is he goes on later in the book, he calls some people call it the natural law or something else. But it's this objective moral standard, for example, like that waterfalls are sublime, or I think sublime means like inexpressibly glorious or something like that. Is that what it is?
Yeah,
it's kind of like indescribable. So it's
a word to describe indescribable, yeah.
Right. So the Tao, Lewis is using the word. He says for brevity, to describe the moral standard, that the standard of values, the system of values that everyone recognizes. Some things are good, some things are bad, some things are true, some things are false. And he's going to then in the next two chapters elaborate on that. So the second chapter is called The Way, and so in the way, what Lewis does is he kind of picks apart what is the motive behind introducing kids to a type of education that divorces them from this objective moral system. I think. How would you describe the second chapter, Casey?
I would say I thought the second chapter had the least. I don't mean this quite how I'm about to say it. The least point to it. I think it was more just the kind of the continuation of his first chapter.
Gotcha. Yeah. I guess it's kind of a bridge to get to the end point in the last chapter, the Abolition of Man, where he points out explicitly what is the scheme of the social elites to alter mankind, and he describes what is the future of mankind in bleak terms. He says that basically we're going down a path of destruction where people through science and through rationalism and humanism are trying to make man what they want him to be, and they start by trying to conquer nature, trying to conquer the things around us, like he gives the examples of the airplane, the wireless, and the contraceptives, and then finally we're trying to conquer the nature of man himself, which is to make him into what the social elites want him to be. But he says at the end, what that will end up being is just basically making man nothing, making man something other than he truly is, and divorcing him from his true value, basically. And
to put it in ways that we can understand a little bit more as far as examples go, I think he gives a couple of good, like one of the best ones would be masculinity in society. That there was, for centuries, there was this masculine ideal of what a man should be. And
does he actually give that as an example?
I
know he gives the example of laying down your life for the good of society.
Yeah. He does that. Yeah, no, I guess he doesn't quite give that an example, but I want to give it as an example.
Well, he gives the example of like heroism, that you give up your life in defense of your country.
And it's not a far leap when he's saying, thus we have men without chests. Mm-hmm. And I think he would have, and we talked about what that means, but I think also partially being like, men, what is a man without his chest? Mm-hmm. But so the example of masculinity is, for centuries we had this ideal of what a man should be. Mm-hmm. You have gentlemen, you have knights, you have chivalry, and not to say that people always lived up to that. They certainly didn't. Mm-hmm. But there was this ideal that we were supposed to live, that we were supposed to attempt for, and that everyone understood that yes, that's what a man should be. Mm-hmm. And in the last 100 years, that has been ripped right down. Mm-hmm. So now there's not even an ideal up there of what should a man be. Mm-hmm. And many young boys are growing up, they don't even have an idea of what they're supposed to be. Right. Some of them think they're supposed to be women. Yeah. And so some of what we say here and what he says, I think can sound very alarmist. He's right in many, many ways. Mm-hmm. And so with the example of masculinity, he's saying we're ripping apart this ideal that has been the bedrock of trying to be good men for basically back as far as time existed. Mm-hmm. And what we're left with is nothing. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what's happened.
Yep. All right, we'll take a break and then we'll get to the last two chapters, and then give a conclusion of some good takeaways from it. So I'll be back in a little bit. Hey, do you enjoy studying the Bible, reading it, and learning what it means to follow Jesus and obey him faithfully? Well, I have a blog called bearingchrist.blog. Its motto is to know Christ and him crucified. There I have hundreds of Bible study articles, devotionals, book reviews, as well as analysis on current events and how we are to live as Christ bearers in this present evil age. Also there, you can check out my new recent book that was just published this year called The New Testament Revival of Western Christianity, How to Restore the Love, Leadership, and Learning that the Apostles Taught. I think it will be a blessing to you. You can get a PDF version for a very limited price there, and you can also find it on Amazon in print and Kindle editions. Again, it's bearingchrist.blog, to know Christ and him crucified. And we're back with the second part of the Abolition of Man, starting with the second chapter, which we described as a bridge. He entitles it The Way. What would you point out as the main points in this chapter, Casey?
Let's see. So one of this is again kind of an implied one that it made me think of a lot was deconstructionism. I don't know, do you know what that is?
Well, it depends on what context. I know there's deconstructionism. There is in Christian circles, there is the concept of deconstructionism being, I
think, pick apart values and deconstruct what people.
Maybe I'm thinking of deconversion.
Okay, well, it's similar though. But so he basically, as I'm reading through this, describes the movement that is coming that would be titled deconstruction. And so this actually became a movement a couple decades after he wrote this, but basically where the idea was we're going to deconstruct, just look, read everything very critically and look at things critically and take down the values. And so this is
explain the argue against the values.
Basically,
that there shouldn't be values at all.
More of that.
Okay.
And the movement was basically saying there aren't values. And this also is very relevant to our Christian walk, because out of that movement has come a specific movement of deconstructing Christian thought, and very anti-Christian. And so you have, for instance, the young Christians that go to college, and you have a large percentage of them that leave the faith. And that there is actually a movement behind this of many, I guess if you wanted to say elites, but definitely people, the media, writing books that are specifically trying to deconstruct the Christian faith in young people. And so I was just thinking about that quite a bit during this chapter as he's talking about these elites writing to deconstruct values, and just seeing that, yes, he's describing what is actually happening right now. So yeah, it started as a philosophy, like I said, a couple decades after.
Right. Philosophical literary analysis that questions the fundamental conceptual distinctions or oppositions. So questions values, basically. Okay, gotcha. That's part of subjectivism or like this what's the,
as we get to postmodern
postmodern thought that nothing is true.
Yeah.
You have your own truth. You can make up whatever is true that you want to be true, and nothing is really objectively good. It's good if you think it's good.
Yeah.
Basically, so like you determine your own values. And how does he describe that in this chapter?
Which part? The
deconstructionism.
Let's see.
Well, he talks about what is the mindset behind the authors of that textbook he was talking about in the first chapter. He says on page 29, in actual fact, Gaius and Titius,
where I was just looking.
Who are the authors? The names that he gives to the authors.
Which a little pause there. I will say, I really appreciated that about C.S. Lewis, that he's calling out this textbook and these authors, and he calls it the Green Book, and he calls them Gaius and Titius, and basically, okay, and they basically just makes up names for them. Doesn't say who they are. Doesn't say what the book is. Wants to make it about the issue, not about a character thing.
Right.
About like a specific, whatever educator.
Yeah.
Anyway,
depends on the context, whether you do that or not. But anyway, he says, in actual fact, the authors, will be found to hold with complete uncritical dogmatism the whole system of values which happened to be in vogue among moderately educated young men of the professional classes during the period between the two wars. Their skepticism about values is on the surface. It is for use on other people's values. About the values current to their own set, they are not nearly skeptical enough. So they're questioning traditional values, basically.
Yeah,
they're trying to debunk them.
A little bit further, the word debunk. A great many of those who debunk traditional, or as they would say, sentimental values, and then they claim to be cutting away the parasitic growth of emotion, religious sanction, and inherited taboos in order that real or basic values may emerge.
And they call them innovators. He calls them innovators. innovating on what are values, and he proposes that they might, instead of being motivated by what's objectively good or true, they're claiming to be motivated by their instinct, by their natural inclinations. And then he says, if you were not going to base your judgments on objective standard, what you're doing is just basing it on whatever happens at the moment to appeal to you most. So it's just completely arbitrary and subjective, and doesn't have any basis whatsoever.
And so I want to say too that in this chapter and along those thoughts, he calls out Friedrich Nietzsche as basically being one of the forerunners of this,
right?
And the idea of, is it nihilism or nihilism? I've heard it both ways.
Nihilism.
Okay,
I believe.
Basically, that calling that idea out too as part of this. And then, so I want to say his conclusion kind of to this chapter are a couple thoughts. One is that doing this, trying to rebel against the Tao, as he put it, is a rebellion of the branches against the tree. Basically saying, if you try to cut off these values to get down to whatever you think you're going to get down to, base values is supposedly what they think, that you're actually just like, you're a branch and you're cutting the tree down. And so like you're going to fall and be left with nothing.
Right.
And then the other one that I wanted to point out near the end of the chapter is he comes to the conclusion that an open mind in questions that are not ultimate is useful, but an open mind about the ultimate foundations, either of theoretical or of practical reason, is idiocy.
Oh, I didn't catch that word that he uses.
It's right near the end of the chapter. It might be... Flip back another page. Let's see.
Idiocy.
Or anything else is the last word of the chapter. Or the word of the...
Anything else?
It
doesn't
of the
matter.
paragraph, yeah.
Just go ahead on your point.
Yeah. So basically he's saying that it's good to have an open mind about things that make sense to have an open mind about, but about foundational principles that we can just prove over and over again must be true, to just sit there and try to question them is idiocy, is what he says. It gets you nowhere, and if you do convince yourself that you're getting somewhere, you're actually just cutting the tree off when you're the branches.
Yep. And then he in the last chapter, I think largely what he's doing is describing what has been going on since at least the Enlightenment, and what is continuing to go on, and what will the end be if the innovators that he calls them are successful in destroying traditional values, basically, and in convincing people that they don't need traditional values. So that's what he called this chapter. The last one he calls the Abolition of Man.
Yeah.
And it's definitely the shorter chapter is chapter 2. Chapter 3 might be the longest one. And he describes to start off the conquest of nature, that man, the elites, the educators, the philosophers, the scientists, they're trying to conquer nature through the scientific endeavor. And part of the scientific endeavor, I think he's implying, is this deconstructionism. Yeah. It's you know.
And when we say like the science, is he readily recognizes that many of the technologies that we've gotten are good, and that there's a lot of good that can come with them. And he actually talks about, taking a middle line that will let you still scientifically go forward and get to benefit from all these technologies without giving up the values.
Now, on that point of the technology, and I think this is pretty insightful in our society, because, remember, this is within the 40s. No smartphones, no personal computers, and most people didn't ever experience any computers. They didn't have, a lot of people probably didn't even have telephones at that time in the 40s. They had they had a radio system, a wireless system. And we live in this digital age where you have constant access to information, communication, all the time. And he, on page 57, this was a striking sentence, I thought. He's describing the progression of history, that every previous generation is exercising control over the succeeding next generations by introducing these new values and removing the idea of holding to these values as a good thing, and introducing to them new ways of living through science and technology. And he writes on page 57 that they are weaker, not the next generations, the descendants are, and what's interesting is he more than once he uses the term eugenics. I guess I'll start with this sentence. In reality, of course, if any one age really attains to increasing human power over nature by eugenics and scientific education, notice scientific education, the power to make its descendants what it pleases, the power to make next generations of people into what they want humans to be, changing people's ways of thinking and living. All men who live after are the patients of that power. They are weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. So when I read that, I just thought immediately of the smartphones we have.
Yeah.
Wonderful machines in our hands, yet we have been preordained how we're going to use them.
Yeah.
Most people do not have control over how they use their smartphones and their computers. They are actually controlled by the powers behind those technologies.
Yeah. And I wanted to point out on that too, as he kind of implies near the end that with technology and kind of like with that, the cost of technology, or really anything, that so many times, especially in our culture, we just plow forward without even thinking of the cost. And I'll give a couple of examples, even like an old example. Automobiles destroyed little communities.
Yeah.
And that before, little communities had to live together to help each other. But then you have the automobile, and you're able to go several miles. You don't need your neighbor for whatever type of goods you needed if you didn't have them. You don't need to go to the same church, right? With all your community, whether you like them or not.
Yeah, by the way, listeners, an automobile is a car.
You guys know that. And so like that's something that obviously we've benefited from cars a lot, but there was a cost. And so just this idea that there's a cost to every technology we accept. And some of them, like TV, I would argue, have very little benefit, but a high cost to our culture. And some like smartphones have a decent amount of benefit, but also a very high cost. But just anything we accept like that, we tend to as a culture just take it from our predecessors or the people giving it to us, without thinking about what will this cost. Anyway, that idea was just one of the ones I wanted to note.
Right. Chief examples today on the cutting edge of things would be AI, artificial intelligence, especially. Maybe there are other things.
Oh, and I guess another thing I wanted to mention was, and this one also made me think of Brave New World, which was obviously written about the same time. Basically, he was saying, and I'll quote it: "The stars lost their divinity as astronomy developed, and the dying god has no place in chemical agriculture." So he's just kind of saying, as science has expanded, our minds have made it so there's no more room for wonder and for God. And I just wanted to bring up Brave New World, which is a very interesting book as far as in a lot of ways accurately predicting
Right.
what would happen in our culture. But so at the end of Brave New World, when they talk to the head guy, and they ask, I think one of the guys asks about God, and the guy's basically like, as far as I can tell, I'm almost sure there is a God, but what's it matter? You know, it's like, it doesn't affect us at all, which is just, you know, an interesting, you know, kind of along this in a very frightening perspective from him. But then also this same idea made me think of, I think it's in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where I think it's Eustace is talking to an aging star, and Eustace explains, well, in our world, you know, stars are just these big, you know, burning balls of gas, and the star goes, well, that's what it's made of, but that's not what a star is.
Right.
And that idea right there that captures that, you know, we try to boil things down in our culture to just a scientific conception and just make it that
mechanistic.
That burning ball of gas.
Right.
But it's so much more than that. You know, the heart of it, the thought of it. You know, what all the
value of it.
Exactly. And just we have lost that. And in general, through education, and that's one of his things here, is just a big about education. That education has lost that, has lost a lot of the great values of the past.
Right.
And you look at schools today, and like the one thing I was listening to, the guy questioned, like, all right, who here in school was required to read Plato's Republic? And not to say that Plato's Republic is, you know, the best book there ever was, but as far as ancient books that have impacted the world in a huge way and have a lot of thoughts that people should be thinking about, and like nobody raised their hands. They weren't required to read it, whereas 2 centuries ago everybody had to read that, and everybody had to at least understand the ideas behind it, whether they agreed with them or not. And just how much we've lost as far as our understanding of the values, our understanding of what's of the Tao, as he would put it, and what's important.
And I wanted to point out. First of all, I wanted to point out that divorcing the value of things in nature, such as the star, from the thing itself. Basically, what you're doing when you do that is you are ignoring what God has put in it to communicate things about himself. Because everything in nature, everything around us, especially things in nature, communicates something about God, about what he is like. Yeah. And if you just look at the parts and how it works and what it does, like what it does, you know, mechanistically, without considering it in the scheme of the whole system of what God has put in place, you are not seeing what God has made. You're basically ignoring God. You're getting God out of the picture when you do that. You're looking at it in a godless world when you're doing that, because everything says the heavens declare the glory of God. Everything declares the glory of God in some way.
And I did want to say on that too, or going forward with that, is he says at some point, nothing I can say will prevent some people from describing this lecture as an attack on science. He says, I deny the charge, of course, but that's very much, a lot of people like to pit religious values, I mean, not even necessarily Christian values, but Christianity is the big one that people fight against, religious values, objective truth, and saying, yes, this is how certain things are, as anti-science, education, that just, and people do like to say that it's religion versus science. But as he says here, I deny the charge. And you look back historically, like many of the great scientists were Christian, right? And we're learning stuff based on that. I know that God made the world in an ordered way, and even looking in the scriptures, several of the scientists were spurred on to discoveries by the scriptures, things they saw in them. But so I just did want to recognize this, the narrative that they try to put of religion versus science, that they're at odds, and if you are pro-religion, you are anti-science, which is ridiculous, but I guess when you give the idea long enough, you can get there.
Right. So, before we come to a final conclusion, how about some? Well, what is his conclusion? At the end, like, does he give any practical steps we should take, or
I kind of mentioned it a little bit, is him trying to come to a, while still having both sides of the objective truth, but still going forward as far as progress, like scientifically. But then I think he finally ends it just with his last. Well, I guess the last paragraph's quite long. That you can't go on, he says you can go on explaining away things forever. You know, that you can cut through to look through certain things, but the purpose has to be to see the truth underneath. That if you just keep looking through certain things, you can just keep looking through and never see anything. But that there is an absolute truth underneath that you need to cut through to see that, and to stop trying to look through everything.
Right. Yeah, basically the way he ends is to describe the hopelessness and the stupidity and foolishness of the way that people were thinking and educating in the elite stratas of society. So he doesn't really give any kind of practical, application, or whatever.
And to be fair to him, this is in the 40s, and so as far as this type of thought process, like, this is something you could read now or read like 20 years ago and think, wow, this person has seen it for what it really is, and he's foreseeing it. I mean, seeing the very start of it. And so I'm impressed that he's able to so accurately describe the state of things so early on, just by seeing the seeds of it. But yeah, like you said, he doesn't really give this is what we should do. If anything, I guess you would say, you'd probably argue that we should go back more towards the classical education to try to teach traditional values, and to promote the Tao, as he would put it. I guess that'd be what he would go for.
Yeah, and of course he's talking to largely professors. Yeah. So they have. It's not like he's gonna necessarily describe what they should do in their everyday lives, but he's just describing how education should be. And then he ends the book by giving an appendix with illustrations of the Tao from various religious traditions, spiritual traditions, like the law of beneficence, from like a bunch of texts, religious texts that he quotes from. The law of special beneficence, or loving your family, duties to parents, elders, ancestors, duties to children and posterity, the law of justice. Yeah.
And he gives just several examples throughout the world of different cultures having this objective natural law.
Right. They have agreed on these certain aspects of.
And he does. I think he did give. I don't know if it was in this one or a different one, where he gave an example of somebody that would say you don't have an objective law of what's right or wrong. Well, if you walk up and punch them in the face, they'll think that what you just did was wrong.
Yeah, right. So I'd like to just briefly talk, just give one or two examples of what is lacking in his analysis. Yeah. Like how does he fall short of how a Christian ideally, biblically speaking, should talk about these issues? What do you think? How would you improve his book, Casey?
So one of the things I saw that I don't know if the word disagree with, but thought he could have had a little bit more focus on this is, well, so first of all, with the Tao, he describes it, and he's not trying to make this a Christian book, but I see it as basically, I saw the fruits of the Spirit in it some. And so I guess in general, that it not being as Christian, which I understood. But the one thing we talked about earlier was that it's kind of not a very hopeful book, right? And just kind of saying we're going this way, and raising the alarm. And
in fact, he basically like almost with certainty describes the end of humanity. And what's sad is he doesn't mention anything about God, anything about like Jesus coming, anything about an eternal state. He says that the human race is going to end in destruction. That's basically what he says.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he quite says that.
He basically
but
says that.
It is very pessimistic as far as
it's not a Christian view.
And so I think the Christian view would be that yes, the world, the devil, the flesh, they've always been out to get us, to undermine the truth. But that God through his Spirit will always preserve the truth on some level, and that there will always be a remnant. And he doesn't have that aspect of hope that yes, God will preserve and God will get at least some of us through, and some of these ideals through, and that God will win in the end. It's more just, I see these values that people used to have, which, and like I said, it's good that they had those values. Even if you look at America, we were a much more moral society a couple of 100 years ago. Does that mean that we were more Christian? In a way it does, but not necessarily. We probably had more people saved, but having somebody moral that's not a Christian is not our end goal.
Right.
And he seems to have that moral, uphold that moral goal of the Tao a little bit more than I would, is so much as we need faith in Christ.
Right.
And so just, I guess in general, he falls short in that end view and his Christian, the Christian view, of Christ specifically, where Christ comes into this.
Right, exactly. That would be my main criticism, is that he does not point people to Jesus.
Yeah.
He just goes on these philosophical arguments, but he doesn't emphasize that the answer to all of your questions and the what's the word? The solution to all of these problems is to go to Jesus and to what he said and what he did on the cross, and to hope in him. So that would be my main criticism of it. That it's not explicitly Christian.
Yeah.
It's not explicitly biblically based.
And to be fair to him, though, I would hold that up as a good criticism. He does say, I am a Christian, but this is not a Christian lecture.
Right. Well, he said, at the very least, what I remember him writing is that he's not trying to convince people of theism.
Yeah. That was my Casey version.
I think he should at least have briefly mentioned that if you have an objective moral standard, that implies an objective moral lawgiver.
Yeah.
God,
I think part of that's implied. And at this point, I would say too, he is well known enough and written enough to try to convince people about the veracity of Christianity.
Gotcha.
That most of these Oxford professors would have been like, here he goes again, type of thing. So I kind of got the impression when he said, like, I'm not trying to convince you of this right now.
Right.
This is a separate issue that I want to bring up, which I wouldn't call it completely separate. But anyway, you get my point. Yeah.
So I'd say if you are into philosophical works, this would be probably for you. It's very heady, so it's not for the average reader. Not many people would really appreciate it, I think, in our culture, at least.
Though it does obviously have many points that are very applicable to our culture.
Right, of course. So this is for an exclusive few people. And as far as its value, it's pretty valuable, but I was kind of disappointed. So I give it like 2 out of 5 stars in terms of recommending it to people, I think.
Yeah, I would say it would depend who I was talking to.
Right.
If I was talking to an educator, this would go up my likelihood that I would recommend it.
Right. But it was a good study. Just a good reminder that everyone has a law on their hearts, just like the Romans said there that I read in the beginning. Everyone has a conscience. Everyone knows there's a moral standard they're going to be held to. That's why people are without excuse on the day of judgment. And so you can use that in your evangelism to share the gospel with people. They already know they've sinned.
Yeah. And if you're looking for more logic apologetics to like that, I think Mere Christianity is much more digestible.
Right.
And not that that's the perfect apologetics book, but it is, like I said, much more digestible than this. That's actually was given over broadcast during World War II to the general populace, as C.S. Lewis was trying to instill hope in them in the Christian God that, at a time when there was not much hope in England.
And Casey, would you recommend the Chronicles of Narnia to most people? Absolutely.
Those are, in my opinion, maybe the best children's fictional literature that's been written. I want to say Till We Have Faces, he wrote, which is not nearly as well known. It's not, I wouldn't say it's children's literature. It might be a little bit older, but it is absolutely fantastic.
That's a novel, right?
It is a novel.
Oh, yeah.
I can let you borrow it if you want.
Not right now, but thanks for the offer.
Let's see. Some other books. Screwtape Letters is another one that is definitely an interesting look into things. Obviously, there's a lot of speculation on his part, but it's more, he understands that. It's more to get you thinking about how there are devils at work. Let's see. Another series of novels is the Space Trilogy. Supposedly the Hideous Strength, I think is like a correlation novel to this one right here. And then he wrote and had many other lectures dealing with a lot of things. So you can find out his opinions on a lot of stuff. But I would say, and we have talked about this, when you read C.S. Lewis, he is not a theologian.
Right.
Well,
he is a theologian. He's a poor one.
Okay. But I would say he is a philosopher.
Right.
He is usually not bringing the Bible into it, and obviously he has read the Bible. He believes the Bible. But
not all of it though.
Yeah, he does have a couple points that we would disagree with him on. But so when you read him, it's his opinion that he has arrived to philosophically or logically. So take it worth that he has a lot of them they're like, oh, that's very insightful, but don't necessarily take it as scripture, or he really took that scripture and explained it well, because that's not what he does.
Right. And we'll end there. Thanks for listening to the King's Hand in History podcast. We hope you've been encouraged by it, helped in your thinking about these issues that we went through. Would you please check out my book, The New Testament Revival of Western Christianity, available on Amazon, that recently came out. How to restore the love, leadership, and learning that the apostles taught. Please check us out on Facebook. We have a Facebook group, the King's Hand in History Students. You can ask to join. Please, if you appreciate this content, follow on whatever your podcast platform is. Like it and share it as well. And until next time, keep looking for the King's Hand in history in your life, and God bless.